Okay, I think I'm going to get started. So good afternoon, welcome everybody. My name is Stuart McIrvin, and I'm going to be presenting here with my good friend here, Joe Staronis. I'm the VP of Product Management for the Security business unit within CA's Mainframe portfolio, and Joe here is the Chief Technology Officer for PKware. Right, so we're going to kind of tag team on this topic today, which is really going to, for you, demystify the interoperable encryption across the mainframe. Please, don't wait for the end to ask questions. Make this as interactive as you want. The usual disclaimer. So I may talk about products, capabilities, features, etc. that are forthcoming. We haven't announced yet, and this just means we can change our plans even though I've announced some of these capabilities. So this is what I'm going to go through. So I'm going to talk a little bit about data itself, some of the regulations, look at the threat landscape that we're dealing with. Then going to look a little bit more on data security specifically, on the mainframe and securing and managing that data. Then I'm going to look at some of the capabilities we have for protecting that data, and then we're going to go into the encryption, the key management, and then we've also got a demo. Okay. All right. So if you look at data today, for many companies, data really is a big part of their business value. Okay, you get companies like Google, Facebook, and I guarantee even the companies we all work for today. A huge part of our value is based on data. I just went out this morning and I looked at what's the value of American Airlines? What's their market cap? It's about 25 billion. Now that's a company that has some fairly significant expensive assets, right? You compare that to the valuation of Facebook, for example, for Google, etc. No, these are hundreds of billions of dollars of valuation. They don't really have significant assets, right? A core part of their value is in the data. So a big part of the valuation of many companies is based on kind of the data that they own. Industries depend on it, whether you're banking, healthcare, or everything else. That data is absolutely critical. And I remember years ago, I'm talking 20 odd years ago, I remember calling up my bank. You probably remember this yourself, and I called up for something, and as soon as they answered the phone, they said, "Oh, hello, Stuart, and how's Terry? That's my wife, and how's she coping with your baby, right? So we just had a new baby." And they had all this information at their fingertips, right? Now back then, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we were collecting all this information. We didn't have the regulations that we had, right? This was, highly personal information they had about me, right? And nobody really bothered, but a lot more regulations. The data we're collecting now is significant, right? As I say here, by 2020, over 40 zettabytes of information will be out there. You've got 6 billion smartphones are going to be there as well, and that think of the data that's getting collected, and then 50 billion smart devices, right? My refrigerators, sending data. It's telling when Stuart took a beer out and did he go for ice cream at midnight and all these good things, right? So plenty of information being collected, but the key part is here is data is a significant asset for a business, but the other part is that it is also a huge liability, okay? There are plenty of regulations out there, HIPAA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, et cetera, and I'm going to go into some of these regulations in a minute. But the other part of this is that it gets personal very, very quickly, right? And it's not just a case of you're collecting all this PII, and some of it can basically be a photograph. Even collecting a photograph on someone is considered PII, an IP address, etc. If that IP address is tied to a person, right, it can be personally identifiable information. The other thing is that when we collect this information, some of the stricter regulations now are actually saying that you must specify the intended use for that data, right? And if you go outside of that, you're out of compliance again. Another piece that's critically important is that as custodians of this data, if the person who you've collected data about comes back in and says, you know what, I've decided I no longer want you to have this information anymore. I would like you to delete it. By law, you have to be able to delete all that, right? So if you've copied it at all different places, do you have the ability to track it? Do you have the ability to find it, etc.? So intended use is critical, you know, and having the ability to understand where it is and delete it is critical too. And I'm not just talking about PI and just about PII. There are other critical types of information, your own confidential information, your financial results, you know, product plans, all these different things, you know, is very sensitive information too. Regulations. So how many of you, just going to see a show of hands, deal with PCI, the data security standard, right? Yep. Any of you in the healthcare industry? Yep. Yep. Okay, so you deal with all of them, right? Can I ask, just a show of hands, are you familiar with the European General Data Protection Regulation? Nope. How many of you have international operations? You deal with Europe, right? You actually have, you know, information. So this affects you, okay? It came into play this year. It is now, it's enforceable. Businesses have to comply with the General Data Protection Regulation in 2018, right? And if you handle data for European citizens, it affects you, right? And it's critical. So again, this is one of these areas where there are very strict regulations, right? Anything with European citizens, the fines are significant. They can be up to 4% of a company's annual turnover, but they cap it at 20 million, right? So you can have a 20 million euro fine. EU-US Privacy Shield, familiar with that? Right? So this is what basically replaced Safe Harbor. And this is one where they specifically do state that you must give the intended use that you're going to that you're collecting this data for, right? You can't go beyond that. You must be able to delete it as well. So your ability to track the information that you keep, and this is information when you know for European data for U.S. companies that actually are you know working with Europe and collecting data on European citizens as well, right? So these are you know these are just some of the high-level ones, okay? But you know, GDPR is a big deal, and also the Privacy Shield. Let me look a little bit at the threat landscape here. Okay, so this is where it really comes from. There are plenty, you know, we've got you know the thieves. When I talk about thieves, we're really looking at the people who are after this information for financial gain, right? So when I talk about business data being an asset to a business, very, very valuable. It's also valuable outside. So you've got all sorts of you've got the service providers, three-letter agencies. You know, these are kind of the snoops. And then, of course, the idiots. Now, when I talk about idiots here, like, you know, it's kind of an unfair term, right? But you know, these are people who make mistakes. And data is lost 100 times more than it's actually stolen. Okay, so the critical point here. So this is where your biggest problem is, right? You know, down here at the bottom. The other part is, though, that insider threat of the actual attacks, right? Anyone know what percentage of attacks actually come from insiders rather than external attackers? Any guesses? 70. Very good, 77%, right, are actually from insiders, right? So having the ability to, you know, track what your insiders are doing and everything else is absolutely critical. Okay, so, you know, I mean, look at this is just looking at some of the different types of attacks here. I highlight this LexisNexis breach, and this was particularly important because when the LexisNexis breach happened, you all, everyone know what LexisNexis and the type of information. They collect all sorts of information, right? Collect information about me, you know, the VIN number of the cars I've owned, right? You know, all my relationships, apartments I've rented, everything, right? And one of the aspects of that breach that was absolutely critical was that they were able, if you have something like knowledge-based authentication, someone comes in and says, all right, you forgot your password, what's your mother's maiden name and all that, they have an enormous amount of data that we're able to leverage for that, right? So that was critical here. But you've got script kiddies that are involved here, competitors that are after information, everything else. Snoops, I kind of covered them, right? And then, of course, the idiots, right? These are the people who are making mistakes, right? And even vendors, right? I put Lenovo up there, HP was up there, shipping viruses in their products, etc., right? Unfortunate, again, shipping product has loads of vulnerabilities. There's all sorts of ways that this threat landscape exposes the data. Now, here's some of the impacts that we've had with data theft. Anyone here in retail? Nope. Okay. So some of the biggest breaches that we certainly had have been in retail. If there was a Ponemon study, basically, they do a study every year, right? And they talk about, what it costs when you have a data breach, particularly, losing credit card numbers, for example. Any idea, any guesses per record what it costs after you've had a breach, right? Per record loss. So let's say you're losing, some of the big ones, 50 million. Do you know what it costs per record to recover from that? Any guesses? Nope. It's about $150 per record, right? And some of the reasons for that is some of the credit card companies are now saying to the retailer or whoever loses it, right, you're going to have to pay for, the new credit card numbers, getting them provisioned and everything else. You actually have to pay for credit monitoring, for the individuals that lose, that have had their credit card number stolen. So you add all that up. And then you start to look at some of these big breaches, 50 million, that gets into billions of dollars, right, is what it costs here. I highlight another breach that happened up here is on the government side. This was the Office of Personnel Management, right? That was a nasty breach because they stole, this was an attack that came from China. They penetrated the federal government, right, Office of Personnel Management, and took a lot of information about federal employees. And some of them were non-federal employees. There were people that were looking for, that were going through security clearance, right, to get a security clearance for the federal government. And I don't know if, have you ever been questioned, about maybe a colleague or someone who's going through, trying to get security clearance, and you've had to go through this questionnaire? Anyone ever had to do that with a federal agent? Yeah. So some of the questions they ask you. So all this information is collected. Some of it is, do you have information about this person that could be used to blackmail them, right? Okay, so this is all stored. This is the kind of information. So now there's information out there, right, potentially for a lot of individuals that could be used to blackmail them, right? So some of these breaches were pretty nasty. In healthcare, I think last year alone, when we looked at breaches in healthcare that involved more than 500 patient records getting lost, right? Anything that was more than 500, there were 235 breaches last year, right? Fairly significant, with a total of 112 million records being lost, okay? Any questions so far? Nope. Yeah, quiet bunch.
So far we're just scared.
You're scared. So let me just get into the mainframe side. So there's no doubt it is the most securable platform of all platforms. It is certainly the most secure, but it's still vulnerable, right? The more open we make this, we have web interfaces, we've got IP connectivity into it, etc., right? So it's certainly a much more vulnerable. We are able to penetrate it. I've told you as well about insiders, right? The ability for insiders to extract information. And then, of course, the other thing is we just move data around now, right? Data gets copied off the mainframe onto other platforms, right? So even though it's still a highly secure platform, there are vulnerabilities and there are ways that this data can be exposed. When we look at, how many of you how many of you use either ACF2 or top secret? Right, okay, good, right. Great way of protecting the mainframe is a very identity-centric model for security. I want to understand who my users are, what permissions they have, and what access I give them, right? But I still need to combine that with a data-centric model of security, right? So it's not just, it's certainly I have to understand my users and what resources they have access to, but I also have to understand my data landscape, right? What data do I have? Where is it located, right? How sensitive is it? Different classifications of data, right? Once I have much more of a data-centric model, understand my landscape, the classifications, I can put the right level of security on that depending on the classification and the risk that data poses, right? So the idea here is we have this model. We really have to provide defense in depth. We certainly need to understand identities and permissions and all that kind of good stuff, right? But we certainly need this data-centric model as well. So let me talk about this data-centric protection. Have you been in any of the earlier sessions and heard of a product we have called Data Content Discovery, DCD? Right? I'm seeing a few nods, some not. Okay. So this is what we introduced this last year, really to start bringing together, right, our identity-centric model, which we have with our external security managers, with a data-centric model. So with DCD, right, now you can start to understand your data landscape, right? We can go out there, we can go scan. It operates, it sits on the mainframe. I don't have to move data off to scan it, right? So I can go scan, I can find data. I can actually classify it, right? So I can now turn around and say, yep, this is PII, or we've got a whole bunch of European passport numbers or driver's licenses and everything else. In addition to that, we support data in motion. So if you're trying to FTP data off the mainframe, we can detect that you're moving sensitive data off as well. Where it gets even more interesting now is if you think back to some of the regulations, PCI, for example. PCI states that you must be able to not only know that you have credit card information and where it's stored, you need to be able to show who has access to it and who has been accessing. So as we integrate this with our ESMs, as you look for this data, as you scan the data, you found that you have PII and its credit card numbers. In the same dashboard, I can basically bring up and say, and here are all the people that have access to these data sets. And in addition to that, then I can also show, okay, so this is all the people who have access, they have the permissions to access it, but I can also show who has recently been accessing it, right? And how many times did they do it? So that's good for PCI, but even some of your own internal audits, right? I can take this information and say, look, I have 75 people that have permission to access it. I have looked, and over the past 3 months, only 25 of them have actively been accessing it. So I can look at that delta and say, look, do these people really need access anymore, right? And I can start cutting off access and things like that, okay? So that's a key part of the protection of this information. Another critical part is, now that I understand where the data is, I understand what I have, right? Another aspect of protection is clearly encryption, okay? And this is where I'm going to hand it over to my friend Joe here, who's going to go into this critical part of data protection, which is the encryption aspect. So, thanks, Joe.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Switch that over. Thank you. There we go. So I just wanted to kind of level set a little bit about public-private key management on ZOS and just level set a little bit before we get into sort of the nuts and bolts of how to do it, is just to level set what we mean by public and private keys and what they're used for. And then towards the end, I'm gonna get into a demo that involves a real live mainframe and an iPad. So there's a good possibility that this will just crash and burn, and you'll be able to see a demo fail in spectacular fashion, but we'll see how that goes. So public keys are going to be used for encrypting data and authenticating. And I'll go into a little more detail and specifically how that's done. And then private keys are used to decrypt data and then for signing. Symmetric encryption. So this is probably the simplest form of encryption that people probably are familiar with. You have a passphrase that's used to encrypt, and you use that same passphrase to decrypt. And as long as you're just going from point to point, that's usually a pretty easy way to do that. Where it gets a little more difficult is, what if I want to now encrypt, for Stuart, and then I want to encrypt for all of you. So now, anything that I've used that symmetric key for to encrypt with Stuart, if I reveal that, now you're going to be able to decrypt anything that I've encrypted for Stuart. So I might have to come up with a different symmetric key if I want to share with everyone here. That gets a little bit problematic and becomes a little more of an intractable problem. So that's where asymmetric encryption kind of comes to the rescue. The beauty of this is that you can actually encrypt with your public key, and let's say if everybody here had a public key, we can encrypt with everybody's public key, and then you just need one private key then to decrypt. Any one of your private keys can decrypt this. It's kind of funny when we hear about politicians talk about outlawing encryption. It's like, it's math. You can't outlaw it.
Oh, yes, they can.
Yeah, they might think they can, but actually, that's how it all came about, right? I mean, when you think about Phil Zimmerman and PGP, the guy almost went to jail just be able to provide people the ability to do encryption, and he got out of it through the First Amendment, or Fifth Amendment. But that's the beauty of this is that it really allows this to work really well within an organization, because you can actually have multiple public keys that are used, and then if I only now just want to encrypt for Stuart, I just use his public key and my public key, and then only Stuart or I could then decrypt that. The digital signing is, I don't know, I'm a bit of a crypto geek, so I really love digital signing because it's actually the part that's kind of missing. When people encrypt data, and let's say if I encrypted a file and I sent the file to you, you think, well, the file's encrypted, so I'm going to trust it. But anybody can get your public key. Anybody, it's no easier place for a man in the middle just to be able to take someone's public key and encrypt it. You just can't necessarily trust information that's encrypted. Part of that is actually understanding who actually encrypted it, and that's where digital signing comes into play. So the way that works is that you take the information and you go through a one-way hash. You use a hashing algorithm like MD5 or SHA-1 or SHA-2. And what that's going to do is generate a unique ID for that particular file. Then you can take the private key, your private key, and then encrypt that hash. And then that becomes the digital signature. Then you send over that information along with the digital signature for then someone to receive. What they're going to do is two parallel paths. The first path they're going to take is to take that original data and run it through the same hash, whatever hash you might have used. Then they're going to, in a parallel path, they're going to take that digital signature, decrypt it with my public key, and then that's going to generate that hash again, and then compare the hashes. If the hashes are equal, that means three things happened. One is that it was authenticated. Authenticated not just to a trusted root, but actually to an end entity. The second thing is it means that there's integrity, that data was not altered in the process of going from point A to point B. So you can validate that it's fully integrity, the full integrity of the data. And then the third is non-repudiation. I can't deny that I signed that file, right? It's a really subtle but sort of important element of data protection, I think. It's also true if you're actually, archiving things for a long period of time and you want to prove that that information hasn't been altered in any way from the time that it was actually encrypted to the time that you might have to validate the contents of that file. So maybe just trying to take this through another example of how this would actually work is that, you take that information and you run it through a hash like SHA-2, and it's going to generate a unique ID. That SHA-2 has not been disproven to be able to provide unique IDs for information. MD5, I think, is still in question, and that's been deprecated from NIST, but SHA-1 and SHA-2 have not. Take the private key and then encrypt that hash. So now I've got a version that's actually encrypted using some RSA crypto. And then I'm going to send both the data and that encrypted hash, that digital signature, to the recipient. And the recipient's going to take that hash, the file, and then run it through the same hash that I used, and then use my public key to then decrypt that. He can get my public key from LDAP or some other source. And then I'll just have to compare the two hashes. So let's take it another step, and let's take a look at encryption and key management on ZOS. And I'll kind of go through it in a little more detail to try to determine where does encryption take place, where are keys stored, and so on. So starting from the center, where the application services are, there's the ability to be able to, and I'll show you a little more detail, of actually utilizing hardware in IBM mainframes and to be able to accelerate a lot of this encryption. And in some cases, you can actually, some of the encryption operations can be more secure. But I think there's a misconception that I think a lot of people believe that in order to do hardware encryption on a mainframe, you actually have to purchase a card, which is not true. It all depends on the type of encryption that you want to do. Every mainframe is shipped with CPACF. It's the crypto that's on the chip itself. And ICSF is a free web download. So between ICSF and CPACF, you can actually do hardware accelerated encryption on a mainframe without having to purchase a Crypto Express card. Now, if you do purchase a Crypto Express card, which can be configured as an accelerator or a coprocessor, that actually can allow you to do encryption and provide some other key management that's that it's different key modes. So with CPACF, you're allowed to do clear key encryption, but with the Crypto Express card, you can actually do two other key modes. You can do secure key and you can do protected key. And what that really means is, in clear key, the private key has some exposure in an address space. So if you were to take a system, an SVC dump or some other address space dump, that key potentially could be exposed. But in protected key and secure key mode, that key is never exposed in the address space. There's some performance trade-offs, but it's all a balance of and security is all about how high of a fence you want to build anyway. So it all kind of depends on the type of data that you're trying to protect, and you actually have the option to do that. In terms of where the keys are stored, there's a multitude of places. And within ICSF, symmetric keys can be stored in the CKDS, but PKI, public-private key pairs, can actually be stored in a multitude of places. So as an example, in SAF, like ACF2 top secret, you can actually store certificates in there as well. Public keys can be available via LDAP. That doesn't necessarily have to be running on ZOS. Actually, in the demo I'm going to show, I'm actually going to pull a public key from Microsoft Active Directory. And then of course, in generating public-private key pairs, you have the ability with ACF2 and Top Secret to be able to generate those key pairs right in the security in SAF itself, and be able to store and export those keys if you need them. So just a kind of a summary of the hardware crypto that's available. Like I said, the CPACF is available on every mainframe. You don't have to purchase any additional hardware. It's available right there. And then of course the Crypto Express cards can be purchased and allow you to actually run in different key modes. And then of course all the algorithms it used to be a case where supported algorithms might have differed based on the machine type, but they're all supported these days. So some key exposures and why this is actually kind of important. And when you think about keys and how those are used and maybe even some of the different modes that you might want to use, of course, the worst place the worst place that the keys could be stored from let's say an easygoing thief is somebody who's actually just providing the key material available to whoever might need it. I always say that the poorly implemented crypto is actually worse than no crypto at all, because if it's poorly implemented, there's this belief that it actually might be protected, and in the event that it's not, I think that's where people run into problems. And so how those keys are generated, where you're storing that information is really important. Once that key is actually generated and it's actually stored within ZOS, it's a question of where that might be stored and then who might get access to it. So like I said, in ClearKey, that actually might be available in the address space for some brief period of time, all depending on where that might be. And how you might protect that. So another source of keys getting exposed, or actually when you're moving them off to other backup sites and other facilities, that's typically where some carelessness might come into play, where those keys get exposed. All right, so let's see if we can make this tangible. I'm gonna see if everything is running here. Okay, let me just quickly set up my see if I can get okay, good. We'll get to that later. So I'm actually logged into a mainframe, and what I wanted to do is actually show you some of the interoperability of actually encrypting a file on a mainframe. In this case, it's going to be a PDS. So file structure that's not really known to other other platforms other than the mainframe, and actually just through email. I'll email it and then receive it on an iPad and then show you how I can actually decrypt that. And I'm actually going to be using hardware crypto on a mainframe along with asymmetric keys, and then as well as a symmetric key, and then show how I'll be able to decrypt that on the iPad. So let's take a look. So here's the job that I was going to use to do this. So as you can see, I've got a job that's going to do the encryption, and I am going to, this JAS out is actually the file that I'm going to be, that's the actual encrypted file. I'm going to use AES 256-bit encryption. I'm going to be able to actually access my public key for this from LDAP, and that's actually on Active Directory, but you can see using my email address here. But I'm also specifying a symmetric key. In this case, it's just going to be PKWare in all uppercase. And I am going to do some transformation from EBCDIC to ASCII. As much as I think we'd all like other platforms to adopt EBCDIC, unfortunately, they go to ASCII. So we'll go ahead and do that. And this is actually what I'm going to be encrypting. It's that PDS is jas.text.lib, and there's two members in it, CRC and EBCDIC. and then I'm going to email that to myself as the second step. So I just wanted to show you the PDS. So like I said, there's two members. So CRC is just a text definition of a cyclical redundancy check. And I do a hexon just to prove there's nothing up my sleeve. It's all on EBCDIC. You see those 4 zeros there for spaces, all right? And then EBCDIC is nothing more than a text definition of EBCDIC. So here's my first opportunity for crash and burn. See if I get something other than a kind code 0. Oh, darn, I got a kind code 0. All right. So I'll just show you the job and some of the particulars in here as well. So there's the ability from an encryption standpoint to be able to specify the hardware facility that you're actually going to be using here. So like I mentioned, I'm doing clear key processing using ICSF and CPACF. And in this case, you can see here that the crypto facility that I'm using is actually IBM hardware. Pseudo-RAM number generator. As like I said, the algorithm I'm using AES-256, but AES-256-bit doesn't necessarily translate to being able to decrypt on any platform. There's still a strengthening mode that has to be used in each encryption algorithm. So things like the recommended way is CBCs, the cipher block chaining, which is what I'm using here. There's other strengthening modes that are used, but not necessarily the strongest. But that along with some of the transformation between EBCDIC to ASCII is where some of the magic happens, I guess you could say. So now I'm going to switch over to the iPad. And hopefully I do have a file that was sent here. So there's the email that I received from the mainframe. And there's the encrypted file. So I'm going to go ahead and open that in an application on the iPad called SmartCrypt that allows me to then decrypt that file. There's the file. And you can see how this is actually represented on a PDS, how this is represented actually on an iPad. It's kind of, PDS, if you think about it, kind of looks like a directory structure, and the members are the files maybe in the directory, at the end directory. So let me go ahead and select, oops, sorry, hit the wrong one. So it doesn't have my private key that allow that to automatically decrypt, and even if I did, that would kind of look like it wouldn't be very interesting. So what I wanted to be able to do here is actually provide the symmetric key that I used. So I'll go ahead and type that in. PKWare. And there you can see the actual ASCII version of that definition of cyclical redundancy check. And I can do the same thing for EBCDIC, and you can see that as well. So kind of in summary, I mean, the thing that is kind of interesting about this is the fact that I encrypted all this on ZOS using hardware crypto, and then was able to then decrypt this on something like an iPad. Now that's more the extreme example. Obviously, it could work just as well on another mainframe, or could actually work on other platforms. But the ability to be able to provide the ability to encrypt without having to go through a lot of other machinations or exposing that data on other platforms, I think is what is important. And being able to provide a chain of custody of that data once it's encrypted so that it's actually never modified. Any questions? Okay. I think that's That's all we had.
All right, yeah. So any further questions on any part of it?
The whole PK-ware thing is really for data transmission. Encrypting and sending is not really decrypting, not really for data at rest in the system.
It is actually used in data at rest as well. And actually can be used in conjunction with DCD. So as that information is discovered as being sensitive, that information could then be encrypted in place, so that that data is not accessible, whether it stays on that platform or actually moves.
Okay, but for example, let's say it's a file used by Kix region, and
Mm-hmm.
you want to encrypt the social insurance number.
Sure.
When the Kix system tries to read the vSAN file,
Mm-hmm.
it's not going to know to ask somebody to decrypt it, is it?
Um,
A whole lot of other things in the way.
Yeah, you would have to have the process, and that actually is available in Kix as well. That would allow that information to be decrypted. So as the file's opened, that information can then be decrypted as well.
So there's a plugin for Kix. Or
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you change key, if you decrypt stuff and encrypt it again with new key.
Sure. There's lots of different ways to do that, and key rotation, I think, is a really important part of security. And different encryption operations can do that differently. In this particular case, we're actually a hybrid crypto system, which means that we use a master session key that's created through a public or a password key derivation function 2 that then does the symmetric, very fast encryption of the data, and then the key material encrypts that session key. So from a key rotation perspective, you're just re-encrypting the key material, not all the data. And the hybrid crypto systems for that reason are extremely valuable, especially when there's petabytes of information that have been encrypted and you have to rotate keys. It would be a pretty expensive proposition to re-encrypt petabytes of information. Yeah. All right.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks.